Good morning. Okay. So we just had started Sif Yud yesterday. Halmana, bein aniya, bein ashira, ein mamashkin in osa klal. If a woman is a widow, you're not allowed to take a mashkon and any collateral from her. Shenemar velo sachavol beged almana. As the Torah says, do not take the garment of a widow. Yesh omrim duhu hadin legrusha, and some say that the same applies to a divorcee. So let's take a look at the basis of this halacha in the Imrei Yaakov over here. Bein ashira, whether she's wealthy or poor. Shenemar lo sachavol beged almana umashma da'afilu ma demutu lachvol ba'acher dahainu al yidei shliach beistin. It seems like even in those situations where you are allowed to take collateral, even when you're allowed to use a shliach beistin, a proxy of beistin, to go in and confiscate material from the house, mikol makom ba'almana aser, but it's not permitted for a widow. Even if she's wealthy. Why? This is very sexist, obviously, because she is at a disadvantage because she's a more weakened person within society. And the idea being is that an almana, a widow, is a woman who has no support neither from her husband or from her father. Because once a woman gets married, her father can wash his hands of her. She's no longer his responsibility. And therefore the same would apply with a divorcee, because she also has the same societal and financial disadvantage of a widow. And so excluded from this halacha would be the case of an unmarried woman who's just single, because her father still has to care for her. And we'll see in a moment that there are some who disagree. I'm not using sexist in a pejorative. Sexism is a reality when a society is such that women are at a distinct disadvantage. So sexism is actually a good thing. It can be a good thing. In other words, sexism gets a bad rap, that people distinguish between men and women, and basically give a woman a leg up because she's at a disadvantage. So some women today claim that that's sexist and that's wrong. Don't hold the door open for me and all that stuff. But the fact is that up until and including to the present, women are at disadvantages, right? It's the whole reason why we have a separate division of sports for women over men is because women are physically not as strong as men. And that's the whole issue with, the transgender guy or whatever. Okay, klal. V'chein hu stimas kol haposkim. And this is the consensus of the poskim, to never take personal, items from an almana as collateral. The chol mili ein mamashkin me almana uveged the kro lavdavka. And therefore, when the Torah says do not take the garment of an almana, it's not specifically the garment, but any item. Ulam b'shilte giborim b'shem riaz kasa delo asra Torah elo beged levishasa umatza osehu chedom. However, there is an opinion of the Shilte Giborim, one of the Rishonim, who says that the only thing prohibited is her personal items, her clothing, her pillows, her, things that she uses on a daily basis that are her personal effects. Aval sha'ar kelim kagon koso shel kesef v'chayotze bahen shari lemashkein heimena she'ein ze bichlal beged. But if she has other items of value, let's say she has artwork, let's say she has silver in the house, those you are allowed to take from her. Why? Because that's not included in what the Torah says you cannot take from an almana, which are her personal effects. So already you see that there's a loophole when dealing with an almana. V'yesh omrim dehu adin ligrusha. Some say the same applies to a divorcee. Ken kasav hasma simin sari zayin sivkat and chav bez. The kasav sham la'afuke mibesula shehi birshus aviyah. So this is to the exclusion of a single woman, right, who is under her father's tutelage. The Taz, however, disagrees. The Taz is of the belief that even a single woman who's really maybe even be living with her parents or is at least financially dependent upon her parents is also included in this prohibition. He says the reason why the Torah uses specifically the example of a widow and not any woman is because the Torah is speaking in what we would say in a common occurrence. A common occurrence is for a widow to be engaged in commercial trade and have to try to fend for herself financially by taking out a loan. But it's not the norm for a single woman who may be a dependent on her father to be dealing in financial affairs. And that's the reason why the Torah chose the example of a widow. But the point being is that according to the Taz, any single woman is at a disadvantage financially, and therefore you shouldn't take her personal items. But the Shach disagrees, and he says that this is out of a special consideration to an almana who is already of a broken spirit. Why? Because she lost her husband, and she's a more mature woman, perhaps, and maybe, has no prospects for her future. So therefore, she is a woman who, because her life is not a happy life to begin with, you have to have additional compassion for her. V'imkein, high time alo shayach begrusha. So therefore, that reasoning would not apply to a divorcee who didn't lose anyone, which is arguable, right? If her husband walks out on her, that sometimes that's even worse than a husband dying. Gam hatumim svirle deikar hu kahashach ve'ein lozuz mimashmos haposuk demayri rak ba'almana. And the tumim, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, also is of the opinion that the pasuk is only referring to a widow and not to a divorcee. V'chas v'shalom lahosif davar shelo kiblu chazal. And he says, God forbid that we should extrapolate based on logic instead of relying on what our sages tell us. So therefore, this halacha is open-ended as far as whom it applies to. According to the Rav Shulchan Aruch, it applies to widows and divorcees. According to the Taz, it applies to all single women. And according to the Shach, it applies to only widows and not divorcees or other single women. Depends on how you look at the scope of this mitzvah. Is it based on a woman's financial disadvantage within society? So then it should apply to all single women. But if you say it's based on her state of brokenness or her emotional state, and that you shouldn't, when a person is in what is it? You don't kick a person in the gutter. Is that the phrase? Don't kick a person when they're down. She's considered emotionally down to begin with. You don't want to add to her sorrow. So that applies, and then it's arguable whether that applies only to an almana or it applies to other women who have gone through very negative experiences in life. That's a very good question. It doesn't state specifically when the loan was made. It just says, and it doesn't even say where the prohibition of the mashkan is. So remember, the mashkain could be to take collateral at the time of the loan. It could also be to once you've given her a loan and it's time to collect, she doesn't have the money. It could also mean to confiscate her personal effects via a proxy of the Beis Din, to repossess her items. So there's a lot of ambiguity in this halacha in general. And he basically says once she's an almana, you can't take any of her items. That's really what the bottom line is. But based on the logic, it would seem that even if the loan was made when she was married, and then afterwards she became an almana, the question is, what are you allowed to take from the estate? Well, you definitely have a lien on the estate based on the fact that when maybe you made the loan, it was to her husband. If she's the heir of her husband, because let's say, which by the way is not the normal state of affairs, but let's say she inherits her husband's effects, then you'd be allowed to. I don't think this halacha would apply if you have a lien on the husband's estate. It probably wouldn't apply in that situation, but it might extend to, let's say, her personal effects. Like we saw from the commentary in the Imrei Yaakov, he says that according to some, this prohibition only applies to her personal effects, but not to her other assets. Okay. Yes, yeah. I mean, you could. It's a very good point, Paul. You could extrapolate this machlokes to any time where the Torah says, "Do not oppress the widow and the orphan," because God says, "I will hear their cries," because no one else will hear their cries. So it implies that there's a disadvantage that they have in society, and it implies that they are more likely to be emotionally distraught when they are oppressed. It really implies both. And so the question therefore becomes, I've always remarked that there are many instances where a divorcee is no different from a widow in your obligation to have compassion in most situations, not in all, especially in today's society. A woman may have kicked her husband out because he was a ne'er-do-well, shall we say, and she kicks him out, and she's of means, and she's fine. Sometimes the sympathy could be to the man. That my sympathies are divided often. When I'm involved in divorces and I know what's going on, sometimes the man is the jerk and sometimes the woman is the jerk. It's there's all different situations, but there are situations where it still happens to be, we still live in a society where men largely have a financial advantage over women. It's not as bad as it used to be, and it's not as universal as it used to be, but still within today's society, women still are working at a disadvantage in many instances, not in all. And it's why you should always encourage your daughters and granddaughters to become financially, be able to stand on their own 2 feet, even within the very, very frum world. I mean, I'm a bit of a hypocrite because my only daughter does not have a professional vocation, but that was her choice. She decided to marry a really good guy from a wealthy family, and she, thank God, is wonderful. But in today's society, really, women should be encouraged to become financially independent. Okay, and by the way, I once heard a shir that the bracha of Baruch Atah Hashem Shelo Asani Isha, thank you for not making me a woman, is really primarily focused not so much on scope of mitzvahs, which is what some Meforshim say, but Shelo Asani Isha is thank you for not making me in a situation of being disadvantaged within society. That if I was a woman, I would really have to work much harder, and it would be much more difficult for me to be financially solvent and independent. If I was a woman, it's not a good feeling to be dependent upon another person for your next meal. Us Yeah. It's very touchy. It's very touchy how you even teach that bracha. But certainly, as we get closer to Yemos HaMashiach, one of the things we learn is that the you know there are many different ways of interpreting this idea that when God created the sun and the moon, they were originally the same luminescence, and then God told the moon to shrink itself. So one of the interpretations of that medrash is that the sun is representative of the male and the moon is representative of the female, and that originally they were of equal stature, equal partners. And God saw that male-female relationships could not endure if they were of equal footing. It would be just too much fighting. So God created a scenario where the man dominates the woman, and that's actually the curse that was given to Chava after the sin, in Gan Eden. It wasn't, well, it says, "V'hu yim shalbach," he shall rule over you, he shall dominate you, was the curse. But as we get closer to the Messianic age, we see an alleviation of all of the curses that happened because of the garden, right? The original sin. So one of the alleviations of the curse is that women become more and more independent of men, and their luminescence starts to rival that of the sun. Just like we say when we say Kiddush Levana, we look forward to a time when the moon will become as bright as the sun, right? So that's what's supposed to happen. There's supposed to be a restoration to some kind of equality between men and women as far as their footing within the relationship. And that's all. Although some may say, oh, this is a negative kind of thing, but there's a positive in it as well. Rav Kook always said, within any social movement, no matter how negative it presents itself, there's always some positive to it as well. He was referring to communism in his time 100 years ago, when he was discussing, the manifestation of the Bolsheviks and the communists. And he was saying that within any social movement, even though ultimately you have to condemn it because its evil overrides its positives, but look, you have to find the positives within communism, in the sense that communism says that everyone should share, everyone should be treated equally. And he says that's a great value. It's doomed to failure, of course, in a pre-messianic world where man is still dominated by his Yetzer Hara, and anyone who's in a position of political influence will abuse that communist ideal, right? People will not share equally when given the opportunity to take more for themselves. And that's why communism is a failure. But he says, but look at the positive idea of everyone getting along and everyone sharing and everyone treating each other as equals, right? So when we look at this, the feminist movement that started in the 1970s, the 1960s, there's a positive aspect to it, which is no more should women be dominated by the other gender. One gender should not dominate the other gender. There's a value in that. Remember, that was a curse in the Torah, that women were dominated by that. Who yim shalbach, he will rule over you. So what happens is sometimes is that the practice of a positive value can be turned into something very negative, right? And it's really manifesting itself in very bizarre ways in today's society, in the 21st century, in the 2020s. But there's still something positive to it. As you can see, what's the alternative? That you have to worry about the widow and the divorcee, because they are on the bottom of the totem pole in the society. Baruch Hashem, we don't have these social plights anymore. It can contribute to the breakdown of family, but as we get closer to Yemos HaMashiach and people are able to eradicate their Yetzer Hara, men are capable of living with a strong woman who has an equal say in how they live their lives. And shouldn't that be ultimately? I mean, if people didn't have the Yetzer Hara and I fall in love with a woman, wouldn't it be the most virtuous thing for us to be equal partners in everything? We control our finances equally. We contribute to the financial state of our home equally. We raise our children equally. Obviously, you have your strengths and I have my strengths, right? But wouldn't that be a great thing for you not to be subservient to me or dependent upon me? Yeah, I think so. There's a lot to talk about here, but you're opening up a whole subject by saying, when the Torah talks about God's concern for the almana, right? That's the reality. That's the reality in almost all of human history, in almost every situation. But as we get closer to Mashiach, and people are able to more easily deal with human relationships because we assume that the Yetzer Hara is being more and more eradicated as we get closer to Yemos HaMashiach, the light of the moon becomes closer to the light of the sun, and it becomes harder for a woman to say, Baruch Hashem Shelo Asani, or for a man to say, Baruch Hashem Shelo Asani Isha, because as women gain more footing within society, why would a man say, thank God for not making me a woman? Which may also contribute to why there's so many men who want to be women today.
It's not such a bad deal.
It's not such, now that they don't have the same disadvantages that they used to. In other words, it may sound funny, but I'm just saying that all of these things that contribute to there's this evolution that we're seeing that, obviously there's a lot of negative to it, maybe mostly negative, but there's a lot of positive that's happening as well. Okay. All right. So, but the follow-up of this halacha in Yud Aleph is v'chol zeh keshe mimashkein bizroa al yedei shliach beistin. This is all, of course, when you are forcibly confiscating collateral from an almana. That's when it's usher. Going back to Brian's question. Avol midas halo ve'muter litol mimenu kol ma shenosein. He says, but when the debtor willingly surrenders assets, then you can take from the debtor whatever he wants to surrender. Afilu kelim shosin bohen ochel nefesh, va'afilu beged sha'alav, va'afilu me'almana. So, up until now, we've been talking about the limitations of what you're allowed to take from a debtor when you're forcibly confiscating their items. So there's limitations. The shliach beistin has to be involved, and you're not allowed to take the law into your own hands. And when the shliach beistin takes their items, they have to leave certain things within the debtor's possession, 30 days of food and a year's worth of clothing, et cetera, et cetera. If the shliach beistin is taking something that they need for their parnasa, then you have to take it during the night and return it to them during the day, and so forth. And you're never allowed to do this with an almana. Again, this is all when you're forcibly taking it away from them. But if, let's say, the debtor volunteers to give you their personal effects, you're allowed to take it from them, even from an almana. That's what the halacha is basically saying over here. And if we go into the Imrei Yaakov, he says, Perish afilu shelo b'shas halva, even if it's after the loan. In other words, not only at the time of the loan, if the debtor willingly says, I'm making this collateral, I'm making my wardrobe collateral, you're allowed to take that from her or from him, right? But even if it's after the loan and the guy defaults and he doesn't have cash, and he says, listen, I feel terrible. I'm going to give you whatever I have because I don't want to be in your debt. He says that's also permissible. But it's still a mitzvah upon the creditor to say, listen, to have rachmanis on the guy or on the woman and say, listen, I know you need these. I'm not going to take them from you. Don't worry. It's okay to be in my debt for a little bit longer. I'll wait until you get the cash to pay me back. It is a mitzvah to be merciful, even when the halacha allows you to take something from them because they've voluntarily surrendered it to you. Okay. Next, Yud Beis. V'chol zeh kishenotel b'toras mashkon, l'hiyos batuach mima'osav, ve'eno rotza litol b'toras piron, mipnei she'eno chafetz bo rak b'mos. He says, up until now, we've been talking about a situation where the debtor is surrendering you an item as a guarantee that he'll pay back. Because the creditor does not want to take this item as payment. Because And in the case where you're taking something which is a personal effect of the guy that he needs, let's say his pajamas during the day or his plow at night, and you keep returning it back to him, you're putting pressure on him because he's going to be embarrassed to go through this process every single day. And eventually he'll be more in a rush to pay you off and to find the wherewithal to pay you off. Aval imbal litol b'toras piraon, rashai litol yedei shliach beis din kol hakelim hayaserim al kedei sidur shemisradrin lebal chov, afal pi shosin bahem ochel nefesh. But he says, if a creditor is willing to take compensation for the debt to pay off the loan, and the debtor is willing to give up these items, so and not only if the debtor is willing to give up the items, but if a creditor is willing to take payment from the items that are the personal effects of the debtor, then the shliach beis din, the proxy of the court, is allowed to confiscate those items as long as he leaves the 30 days of food and the year of clothing for the debtor. And as we said before, anything which you use, any pot which you use to prepare food, you're not allowed to confiscate. That doesn't hold true if the person is willing to take compensation from that pot. Kilo ikpida Torah ela al shvisas kelim sheosim bahem ochel nefesh sheyishpresu mimalachtam kol zman shehem birshus hamalva. He says because the Torah only wanted to make sure that if a guy owns a pot, for example, which he uses to cook his food, or a shechita knife, like we said yesterday, that he uses to slaughter an animal, those you're not allowed to confiscate, because if he's only taking them as collateral, then ultimately you're causing this guy to suffer. The debtor's going to suffer because he doesn't have the wherewithal to prepare his meals, and the creditor is not using them. He's just keeping them in his possession as collateral. So because the creditor can't use them because he's holding them as collateral, not as payment. He says, and therefore it's a waste. The Torah says, what's the point? If the guy needs these things to prepare his daily meals, it's not appropriate for you to take it away from him. But if you're taking it as compensation, so then afilu beged almana mutar litol b'toras piron imhu yasser michdei siddur bal chov. But if you're willing to take these things as compensation for the debt, and just basically have them as payment, so then it's permitted to take even a person's slaughtering knife and his pots and pans. Those you are allowed to have confiscated from the bailiff, and that's true even from an almana, even from a widow. So we'll just go over this halacha once again tomorrow, and just to get more clarity on what we've just said. So we'll continue Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.